Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be counting down my top 20 favorite albums of the 2010s. Yes, I'm aware it's July now of 2020. I probably should have had this list out sometime earlier this year, but I wanted to give a little bit more time for me to kind of digest some of the albums I heard towards the end of 2019, just to see how they would end up landing here on this list. Because this list is one that has changed quite a lot since I started working on this video back towards the end of last year. I believe it was like in December of that year I started ranking stuff out for this list. And come December of this year, I wouldn't be surprised if this list also looked really different compared to how I have it now. But, you know, we're just going to go for it here now in July of 2010. We're going to see just what these 20 albums are as of this moment for me. And I do genuinely feel like all 20 records here on this list are very much worth your time and are very much worth checking out. You know, it wasn't an easy list for me to put together. I feel like there's plenty of albums out there that are also worth checking out that didn't happen to make the cut here. But, yeah, I don't have time to talk about all those albums today. We're just going to be talking about these 20. It's probably going to run long enough as it is, so yeah, let's not waste any more time than we have to. Just a couple other things I want to say before we get into the list itself. First and foremost is that when it comes to my musical knowledge in the 2010s, I've heard a lot more records from the second half of the decade than the first, and that's just because I listened to a lot more music in the second half of the decade when compared to the first. I became a much more active music listener around like 2014, 2015, and because of that, I just heard more records from the second half of the decade. And a lot of the records I heard from the first half, I actually listened to them in the second half of the decade. I didn't really hear them when the albums first came out, though there still will be albums from earlier on in the decade that appear on this list, some pretty highly. I just wanted to get that out of the way in case you noticed that there's a few more records here comparatively from the second half of the decade when compared to the first. You know, there's not much I can really do about that if I want to get this video out sometime soon. But as I said before, I feel like all the albums here on this list, regardless of which year they were released in, are all very much worth listening to. So I don't really feel like it's that big of an issue. The second thing I want to say is that the rankings here in this list are just based on my own opinions. They're not based on the critical acclaim behind these records. They're not based on how many people out there tend to like these projects or the cultural significance of any of these projects or anything like that. It's just my own personal opinion. So if your favorite record from the decade or really culturally significant record from this decade doesn't happen to appear on my list, it doesn't mean that I don't like the record, it doesn't mean that I don't respect the record or anything like that. It just means that I probably didn't hear the album, or that I did hear it and I did like it, but it didn't happen to fall into my top 20. So yeah, just don't get too upset if your favorite project isn't on this list or anything. Like I said, the ordering of this list has changed around quite a lot over the past few months, and it probably will going forward as well. So yeah, let's get started with my number 20 pick on this list. We have the Foo Fighters with their album Wasting Light, released in 2011. This is actually one of those projects that was released earlier on in the decade, and I actually heard it earlier on in the decade too. And it's just a really fantastic record from the Foo Fighters. Foo Fighters are one of my favorite bands, and while for the most part the 2010s were kind of a weak decade for them, probably their weakest so far, this stood out as a high point for them in an otherwise kind of mediocre decade. And not only is it a high point, but it's a really high point too. Stylistically, the Foo Fighters aren't doing anything super new or innovative for themselves here on this project. It's just their typical brand of really straightforward hard rock and post-grunge, but I think they're able to pull it off really excellently here on this album. There's really catchy hooks strewn across this thing, lots of great riffs. The production on this thing is really great too. I love the really raw sound of it. There's a nice variety of tracks on this thing as well. You'll have your typical fun, straightforward Foo Fighters tracks like Rope. You'll have really aggressive tracks like White Limo. You'll have some more emotional moments like These Days and Walk. It's just the Foo Fighters doing what the Foo Fighters do best, and while I don't like this record quite as much as a project like The Color and the Shape, for example, I still think it's a really fine moment from the Foo Fighters in this decade, and it's certainly a rock record that you need to hear. Moving on, the next record I have on the list is David Bowie's Black Star, released in 2016. This is one of those records that, you know, a lot of people have already heard or heard of at the very least, just because it was the final release from Bowie before he passed just a few days after this album was released. And one thing I really appreciate about this record is how unique it is in regards to dealing with the themes of death, mortality, things like that, particularly Bowie's own death too, considering that I guess he was aware that he wasn't going to be with us for much longer in the process of creating this project. And there's very few albums out there that manage to pull off a concept like this, just because, most artists tend to not really know when they're going to pass, so they don't really have the time to make an album like this, really. Or, in the case of a band, it's kind of difficult to do because the band isn't really like a living thing itself. But in the case of this project here, the concept not only exists, but it's executed really nicely too. The lyrics here on this project are fantastic, and I love how Bowie explores this theme here on this project of death, and it just ends up being a really impactful listen, not just because of how well written it all is, but also just because of how true it ends up being too, given that Bowie, like I said before, ended up passing away a few days after this album's release. There was not just the concept and the lyrics of this record that make this project great, it's also the instrumentals on this project too, which have this kind of dark, jazzy sound to them, which are pretty unique for Bowie, pretty unique for rock music, generally speaking, in 2016 as well. There's plenty of artists, around the same age as Bowie that at this time period could probably just, pump out generic material and just have it sell well because of, their established brand and things like that. But Bowie wasn't doing that here on this project. He had a very unique sound and style and concept he wanted to explore here on Black Star, and he did it, up to the very end of his life, and that's a very impressive thing. So yeah, this is a fantastic project. I'm sure you've already heard of it at the very least, but if you haven't actually taken the time to listen to this thing, certainly change that, because like I said, this is one of the best records of the decade and one of David Bowie's best records too, and there's not many artists out there who are putting out some of their best material, just days before their own death. It's a pretty impressive thing. Rest in peace, David Bowie. This is a great project. Check it out. Moving on, though, the next project on the list is Tyler, the Creator's Flower Boy, released in 2017. Prior to the release of this project, I had heard of Tyler, the Creator before. I was familiar with some of his albums and songs, but I wasn't a super big fan of his necessarily. The whole kind of edgy shock rap thing was already starting to not really be my style around the time that I discovered his music. But with the release of this album, it completely changed that for me, just because this is a project that stylistically is very different than anything Tyler, the Creator had done prior to it. It's a lot more introspective, it's a lot more personal, and just when it comes to all the performances here on this thing and the production, it's a lot more interesting and creative too. Tyler's rapping on this project is fantastic. The production here on this thing is great too. I love how lush and soulful it sounds across this project. All the features that pop up on this thing do a great job of adding to their particular tracks too, and they tend to have really great chemistry with Tyler as well. The hooks on this thing are memorable, and the lyrics are really well written as well. Like I said before, this is the first time really where I feel like you get to get really personal and intimate with Tyler in a way unlike anything he was doing on previous releases. Because sure, there were personal moments on those previous releases of his, but this time I feel like it's presented in a very straightforward manner where it's just hard to miss what he's talking about here on this project, talking about his own loneliness, his sexuality, his personal life, and it's very entertaining stuff. It's, I'm sure for a lot of people, really relatable stuff as well. And when the presentation here on this project is this good, when you're talking about the performances and the production mixed with the lyrics and what they're talking about, it just leads to one of the best hip-hop releases of the decade, in my opinion. Certainly one that I think people will still be talking about in the upcoming years. Check it out if you haven't. Moving on to the next spot on the list, we have some more kind of quirky hip-hop from 2017. It's Brockhampton with their first studio album, Saturation. This was a project that when I first heard it around the time of its release, I was just instantly sucked into this project's sound just because of how creative and interesting it was compared to a lot of other projects I had heard. Brockhampton do hip-hop in a way that I think is really creative. I love the fact that all the members in the group have their own unique quirks and personalities, but at the same time they're able to come together in such a cohesive manner that at the same time allows for all the different members of the group to play off each other's strengths and make a whole product that's better than just any of the members could do on their own. The rapping on this project is fantastic. The singing that pops up on this thing is pretty great too. The hook work on this album is phenomenal. Some of the catchiest hooks I've heard in a hip-hop project all decade appear on this project, especially on tracks like Gold and Boys, Milk. Some really phenomenal hooks on this thing. Kevin Abstract has a great way with coming up with some really memorable hooks that will just be stuck in your head for days. And on the first Saturation project, I feel like he has some of his best in Brockhampton's entire discography. The production here on this thing is fantastic too. Very colorful, very playful, has a bit of a summertime feel to it as well. It's just very fun and quirky in a way that I really enjoy. Another really unique thing about this project, at least compared to all the other Brockhampton releases, is just the hunger and the desire for success that's just shown through this project. Not necessarily strictly in the lyrics or anything like that, just in terms of the performances and the sound of this thing. There's this kind of frantic, desperate feel to this record at times, where you could just tell that these guys really needed to get some success and really needed to just get some stability in their lives from that success. And, they did end up getting that, because this album ended up performing really well for them and led to several other albums that ended up doing even better for them. But looking back on this album from 2020, that hunger is something that hasn't been replicated on any Brockhampton release since. And while I do like a lot of the different things that Brockhampton have done on their future releases, believe me, we will be talking about some of those later on in this video, the hunger here on this record is something that's still really unique to this project, I feel, and something that I don't really think the band will ever be able to replicate again. But overall, Saturation is a really quirky, really fun, really creative hip-hop project. Again, fantastic performances here on this thing, fantastic instrumentals, a good variety of styles and different kinds of tracks that you get here too, and it's just a super fun project pretty much. Check it out if you haven't. Moving on, the next pick on my list is Attitude City from Ninja Sex Party. Yes, I'm dead serious with this pick here, because while this is a comedy record, one thing I really appreciate about this project, and really just Ninja Sex Party as a whole, is that while they do have, comedic lyrics in their songs, they also have really well-developed songs too, with enjoyable instrumentals that make coming back to these songs really fun. These aren't the kind of tracks that you want to listen to just once, because, they might be funny on the first listen, but that's all you really get from it. This is definitely an album I can come back to over and over and over again, just because the songs themselves are enjoyable to listen to, just beyond the jokes. Like I said, a lot of the instrumentals here on this project are really fun. The production maybe isn't necessarily the greatest throughout this thing, but it's never to the point of it ruining the project or anything quite like that. I think the synth work across this thing is pretty fantastic. The vocal performances on this thing are great too. The hooks on these songs are absolutely catchy. They will be stuck in your head for days, regardless of how ridiculous the lyrics associated with them are. Some of these song structures and ideas on this thing are pretty creative too. Like, they have a multi-part, 8-minute long parody of Rush's 2112 called 6969, which is just absolutely ridiculous and wild in the best way possible. It's easily the best moment on this entire project. Super creative, funny and creative as well. It's just a really interesting track from these guys, and I think it really highlights the fact that, as I said before, Ninja Sex Party, they're more than just a one-trick pony when it comes to their jokes and their songs and things like that. They have actual, fully developed song ideas to go along with these jokes that make coming back to these songs, something that you can do, and I really appreciate it here on this project. Though I should note that when it does come to the humor on this thing, it's quite entertaining as well. Of course, humor is a subjective thing. I'm sure that Ninja Sex Party's brand of kind of juvenile humor may not be for everyone, but I think the kind of silly type of humor that they play into a lot on this thing is kind of entertaining. I think it works well with the really upbeat, fun sound of a lot of their instrumentals, and I just thoroughly enjoy it pretty much. As far as comedy releases from this decade goes, I feel like Attitude City is one of the finest, has some fantastic hooks, some pretty funny lyrics, some great concepts too. Just a really funny comedy record if you're into that kind of thing. Moving on though, the next record I have on the list is also from 2015, but it's a release in a very different vein than the last one. It's Panopticon's Autumn Eternal, my favorite black metal release of the last decade. It just has a fantastic atmosphere on this thing. The way that Panopticon is able to capture the feeling of an American autumn on this project is something I hadn't heard done yet on any other release out there. Not that I've heard a ton of releases about autumn specifically or anything like that, but I feel like the feeling of the fall season is perfectly captured here on this thing. You could just feel the oranging leaves on the trees and the dead leaves crunching under your feet as you walk through the woods as you listen to this project. And considering a lot of black metal, especially atmospheric black metal, strives to attain, the atmospheric feel of nature or a particular season or something like that, this album is just a massive success when it comes to being able to do that. And at the same time, I really love how this record's able to capture that kind of wild side of nature as well, especially when it comes to some of the ferocity on display in the performances here on this thing. The guitar work and the drums on this thing are furious. The vocals here, it sounds almost like the woods themselves have kind of come to life and are just howling to you as you listen to this thing. Maybe that's a bit of an abstract metaphor, but personally that's just kind of what I envision when I listen to this project. I also really like some of the more stripped back moments on this thing instrumentally too, the moments where some of that Americana and folkier instrumentation is allowed to kind of shine in the forefront of this thing. It just further adds to the atmosphere of this thing. You know, this record isn't this consistent, brutal onslaught of black metal. You have these more beautiful moments that are a bit more calm and stripped back mixed to it as well, in order to give this record even more textures and even more layers than you would have otherwise. Overall, Autumn Eternal is just a fantastic black metal release. I love the atmosphere here on this thing. I love the sound of this record, the instrumentation, the vocals. It all comes together to make a fantastic listen. Please check this album out if you haven't done so and you're into black metal. You will not regret it. Moving on, though, the next track that I want to talk about is the 2019 self-titled record from Injury Reserve. This is a release that I feel like sums up a lot of what was going on in the kind of weirder, more experimental areas of hip-hop in the 2010s really nicely. Not necessarily that it's the most important record in that scene or anything quite like that, but I just feel like if you listen to this record, you'll have a pretty good feel for a lot of the different sounds and ideas people were playing around with, just because this is such a creative and interesting record that I think takes a lot of influence from lots of different types of weirder experimental hip-hop that was being released in the 2010s. There's so much interesting variety here on this project. You'll have some pretty straightforward tracks on this thing, like Jailbreak the Tesla or Wax On, for example. You'll have your more introspective moments on this thing as well, like What a Year It's Been or Best Spot in the House. Stylistically, you'll have some tracks with some weird switch-ups in them, like GTFU, or the track What a Year It's Been. You'll have the jazzy close to this thing, Three-Man Weave, the just really odd New Hawaii on this thing. The track Rap Song Tutorial is this song where they're essentially like building the song as they go along, starting out with just the very basic elements and slowly piling on different parts of the track. An idea that seems like it might not work out all that nicely, but the band is able to pull it off well just because every individual part of the song sounds so good that even when it's really stripped back to the most basic elements, it still sounds really entertaining. The production here on this project is really creative. The rapping across this thing is really excellent too, both from the guys in Injury Reserve as well as all the featured artists that pop up on this thing as well. Every single feature here on this thing really kills their performance and does an excellent job adding to the feel and the creativity present here on this project. Overall, Injury Reserve, the album, not the group, is just a really creative, fun, experimental hip-hop project, one that I find myself coming back to over and over and over again just because of how much there is to really sink your teeth into and enjoy on this album. Overall, if you like quirky, weird hip-hop, I feel like this is a release that you should certainly hear. It's a shame that Groggs passed away just a few weeks ago from when I'm filming this video, because, you know, not only did we lose someone, and, you know, that's just terrible on its own, but also just because Injury Reserve on this thing, we're doing some really creative stuff, and I think it'd be interesting to see what they would have done had they still been a three-piece going on, you know, into the future. I have no idea what the future plans for this group are now after his passing, given that, you know, it's so soon after that happened, but it will be interesting to see. But I will say thank you, Groggs, for all your contributions to Injury Reserve, not just here on this project, but also on all the other releases from Injury Reserve, because I do love all those projects too. But I feel like the self-titled album from last year, this is the project that, at least as of right now, is the best thing Injury Reserve has done so far, and overall just a really fantastic creative hip-hop project. Moving on, the next pick on my list is the 2017 record from Elder, Reflections of a Floating World. This is just a really fantastic, kind of psychedelic, spacey, progressive doom metal album. I love the atmosphere here on this project. Like I said before, it has this kind of spacey, psychedelic feel to it, almost summer-like too when it comes to the tone of this project. It just has this kind of warm feel to it that reminds me a lot of the summer season. I always love to come back to this record when it starts to get warm out, just because I feel like it fits the mood really nicely. Maybe I'm the only one who feels that way, but it is one thing I really enjoy about this project. The songs on this thing are really well structured, lengthy tracks, but I feel like there's constantly really interesting stuff going on in these songs, to the point where none of these tracks feel like they overstay their welcome, and nearly the same could be said for the album too. It just feels like it's constantly giving you something to chew on and to enjoy, and with the really nice atmosphere I described before, it helps make this thing feel like a very cohesive listen to. It's an album that once you step into its first track and get introduced to the world that this album is trying to show you, you will be stuck in that world, enjoying yourself until the album is over in the best kind of way. The vocals on this project are fantastic too, really forceful, very powerful. I wouldn't say that there are really any moments on this project that are super catchy, but there are some very memorable melodies packed into this thing, and overall the vocal performances just add a ton to the character of this record. If you're a fan of doom metal, progressive metal, really just kind of spacey, psychedelic stuff, then you need to check this out, because of all the records I heard in the last decade that kind of fall into that style of music, this is my favorite for sure. But let's go back to 2015 with the next pick on my list. It's Marianas Trench with their album Astoria. When it comes to pop rock from the 2010s, I wouldn't say that the 2010s was necessarily a great time for that style of music, just because it seemed like so much pop rock just tried to do what other kinds of mainstream pop were doing. But Marianas Trench here on this project managed to do pop rock just perfectly, because they have all the stuff that you tend to like from pop rock, really catchy hooks, some fun straightforward structures to these songs, really bright instrumentals too. But at the same time, they add so much more to this record as well. This is a concept record with a story running throughout it. The amount of variety that you get when it comes to the instrumentals here on this thing is a lot more than you typically find on your average pop rock release. And there's some songs on this thing that structurally are just really interesting too, like the opener and closer of this record, for example, two tracks that have multiple parts to them, but every individual part is still just so fantastic on its own. Marianas Trench just found the perfect way for themselves to do pop rock, but in a way that doesn't feel super restricting and super simplistic, really. It feels like it has all the stuff you like from pop rock, the catchiness and all of that, like I said before, but there's so much more going on here that makes coming back to this album particularly enjoyable. There's a good variety of upbeat tracks, some slower tracks, more introspective songs. You just get so much here on this project. It's so much more than you typically expect from this style of music, but Marianas Trench, they just pull it off so excellently here on this project. If you want catchy rock music, catchy pop music, this is certainly a release you need to hear, and you really need to check out Marianas Trench in general, because pretty much all their other projects are just as enjoyable, or almost just as enjoyable as this one, with the exception of their last release, which I thought was kind of average, but even that project had some really enjoyable moments on it too. These guys are definitely one of the best names out there in pop rock and this style of music, and Astoria, at least as of right now, is the best thing they've done so far, so please give this album a chance, give it a listen, you will not regret it. Coming at the next spot on the list, though, we have Danny Brown's 2016 record, Atrocity Exhibition, another really creative piece of weird experimental hip-hop from the 2010s, but one unlike any other, I feel, because the tone, the feel of this thing is just unlike anything else, really. I love how nightmarish and hellish this record sounds, and it pairs up really nicely with the concept of this record, exploring this very dark, drug-fueled addiction that I don't really feel like any other artist, at least in this style of music, has tried to do on a concept album like this before. The instrumentals here on this thing tend to be very wild-sounding, very noisy, kind of abrasive, maybe even a little bit playful at times too, but in this kind of dark, sinister way, especially on a track like Ain't It Funny, for example, which is probably my favorite song on this entire thing. Some of the instrumentals here do have a bit more of a sadder, darker sound to them too, which pairs up nicely with some of the more introspective moments in the lyrics, or some of the more straightforward introspective moments, that is. And when it comes to Danny Brown's rapping here on this thing, he just kills it. He has this very exaggerated style of rapping that is kind of difficult to explain, but if you've heard him rap before, you know what I'm talking about. It's almost cartoonish in its delivery, but I think it pairs up really nicely, not only with the kind of cartoonishly dark instrumentals here on this thing, but also when it comes to painting this very dark, sinister, image with a lot of the lyrics here on this thing. He does occasionally dip into his more traditional style of rapping too, and some of the more straightforwardly introspective moments that I mentioned earlier, but I really like the dynamic here on this thing between some of his more traditional rapping and the very cartoonish, wild style of rapping that he tends to be known for. In addition to all this, I really like the way that he does the lyrics here on this project. While the topic of drug addiction isn't something that I can relate to personally, I feel like when I listen to this thing that I really get what he's talking about here on this project, like between what he's saying, the way he's saying it, and just how the instrumentals sound when paired with all of it. He just is able to paint a picture in a way that allows me to really just kind of get where he's coming from. Again, while it's a topic I'm not familiar with myself, this album here is probably the closest I've gotten to understanding, at least when compared to any other album I've heard personally. This album also has some pretty memorable hooks on it too, some pretty great features. While there's not a ton of them here on this thing, when they do pop up, they end up adding quite a lot of enjoyment to this thing. Overall, Atrocity Exhibition, it's one of those records that's gotten a lot of acclaim, and rightfully so in my opinion. Definitely check this thing out. Next up, I have Brockhampton with their album Saturation 3, released in 2017. I said earlier on the list that we would be coming back to these guys, and yeah, that's because the first Saturation record wasn't even the best project they dropped in the 2010s, not even the best in the Saturation trilogy, as I feel like the third in the series is the best out of all of them. This album has a lot of what I enjoyed in the first Saturation project, a lot of the great chemistry between the different group members, lots of diversity when it comes to what the different group members are able to accomplish, lots of colorful instrumentals, but I feel like Saturation 3 does it just a little bit better than the first Saturation project did. Some of the group members venture out and try some new things here on this project and ends up working really well. Some of the instrumentals here on this thing are a little bit more memorable. The chemistry between the group members here is stronger than it was on the first Saturation project, or the second one for that matter. And some of these song ideas here are just a bit more creative too. Some of the multi-part tracks on this thing, like Sister Nation or the closing track Team, and you also have some just other really odd cuts here, like the opening track Boogie, which is just this really noisy, loud, abrasive banger to open up the project, unlike anything else Brockhampton has done either before or since. And while lyrically Brockhampton stay on a lot of these same kind of general topics that they were talking about in the first Saturation project, lots of personal stuff, things of that sort, the hunger I mentioned earlier when talking about the first Saturation seems to be swapped out in favor of some uncertainty when it comes to the group and their success and things like that. On the one hand, you have some very celebratory moments on this thing where, of course the group is happy because of the success that they had achieved by that point in 2017 with the third Saturation project, but I also feel like there's certain moments on this project where the group seems a little uncertain about their future and what it has in store for them. It's a topic that's explored a lot more on the couple of follow-up records to this one, but I feel like it starts to show through on this project at times too. Overall, Saturation 3 is just a very quirky, fun hip-hop project that I feel like if you're a fan of this kind of music, you should certainly check out. Yeah, give this thing a listen. Moving on, though, we're moving on to the next spot on the list with Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, released in 2015. This is one of those albums that really needs no introduction. It's one of those projects that seems to be universally loved, universally praised, one of those projects that lots of people, tend to predict will become a classic in the upcoming years just because of how culturally significant and high quality it is. And some people might even just be upset by the fact that this album isn't higher on this list, honestly. But personally, I do really love this project, but there were just a few other records that beat it out here on the list. Though, like I said, I do really love this project, though I'm not going to talk your ear off about stuff that you probably already heard about it at this point. Though I will say that this manages to be a very dense, very creative hip-hop project. Kendrick's rapping here on this thing is fantastic. The hook work here on this thing is really memorable too. The production here on this thing, which is jazzy, occasionally funky too, is also very creative. It pairs up really nicely with Kendrick's delivery as well. The lyrics here on this record kind of talking about Kendrick and just being a black person in America in 2015 when this album was released. There's so much stuff packed into the lyrics here on this record. I'm sure there's many other people out there on YouTube or maybe off YouTube who have done detailed, full analysis of this record, which are probably what you'd want to look at if you wanted to figure out what the record is about if you don't want to do it yourself, but I'm not going to do it here because it would take way too long. But I will say that there is a ton of stuff packed into the lyrics here on this record, pretty much all of it which is really high quality, and yeah, it just leads to a very enjoyable record, and I can certainly understand why a lot of people look at an album like this and see a lot of significance in it culturally just because of how much stuff he's able to get across in the lyrics here on this project. Yeah, overall, To Pimp a Butterfly is just a really fantastic record. It's got great performances, great features, great production, great lyrics. I like that this record is one that I can come back to and enjoy quite a lot. I know lots of people feel like this is the kind of record where you don't really come back to it all that much, but personally I really disagree with that opinion. I feel like this is a record I can come back to over and over again, even if it's the kind of record that is, really dense and really lengthy and there's so much packed into it. It's a record that I have found to be consistently rewarding when returning to it. So yeah, if for whatever reason you have not listened to this album yet, despite the fact that it's like one of those albums that the internet will not shut up about, maybe you should take the internet's advice for once and actually listen to it, because the internet was right when it comes to praising this record. It's well deserved. Next on the list, though, we have another album from 2015. It's Ghost with their album Meliora, a really fantastic, straightforward heavy metal release. Ghost aren't necessarily doing anything super new when it comes to traditional heavy metal here on this project, but they perform it so well here on this thing that I've come back to this album super consistently over the past half a decade or so since this thing has been released. The riffs here on this thing are super memorable. There's a good amount of variety in these songs here too. You'll have a really straightforward, aggressive tracks like From the Pinnacle to the Pit. You'll have some grander sounding moments on this thing like He Is. You'll have doomier moments on this thing as well. There's just a good amount of stuff on this project to keep you invested, even if this is a style of music that has been around for like half a century at this point. It still feels super fresh and interesting when you actually listen to this thing. The vocal performances here are really strong. So many catchy hooks on this thing too. And when it comes to the lyrics of this project, I like how Ghost took their typical Satanism and twisted it into something a little bit more grounded here on this release. On their first couple records, they were going on about Satan this, Satan that, whatever. But it was mostly in a kind of campy sort of way that was just supposed to be kind of cartoony, and I didn't think that was necessarily a bad thing. But here on this record, they're actually able to take that and ground it a bit more and actually tie it to some more real-world topics and ideas in ways that are actually kind of interesting to listen to. The lyrics here on this project aren't just straight-up camp. They still are pretty campy, don't get me wrong, but there is a little bit more to digest here, especially on tracks like He Is, or From the Pinnacle to the Pit, for example. It just feels a bit more serious this time around, and with some really fantastic performances and instrumentals, this whole project just ends up being a really memorable metal experience. So if you're looking for some really good, straightforward, traditional heavy metal, Meliora is probably the finest you could find from the last decade or so give this thing a listen for sure. Moving on to the next release on my list is Gorillaz with their 2010 record Plastic Beach, one of the earlier releases from the 2010s that ended up on this list, but certainly one of the best in my opinion, because this is just a super creative, interesting record from the Gorillaz. On this release, the Gorillaz do their typical brand of genre blending in a way that feels like it feels really natural, but at the same time there's so much packed into it that it feels like it almost shouldn't make as much sense as it does. But I think one of the things that really helps hold it together on this project is some of the concepts present here on this record of artificiality and pollution, especially when it comes to not only the lyrics here on this project, but also how this thing sounds. A lot of the instrumentals here had this kind of synthetic electronic sound to them, more so than the Gorillaz had ever played with prior to this release. And in universe, for the fictional band that is, how they're missing two of the band members, and they kind of fill in the blanks for where they lost those two with a bunch of features here on this project. I like how they came up with that concept to justify all the features here on this thing and how they tie it together in a way that, like I said before, feels really cohesive, even though on paper it seems like it really wouldn't work all that well. Because you have some pretty straightforward hip-hop tracks on this thing like White Flag, or Sweepstakes. You'll have your more synth pop oriented tracks like On Melancholy Hill and Rhinestone Eyes. You'll have weird genre mix-ups on tracks like Stylo, which has, 2D doing his typical thing. You have Bobby Womack on this track doing his soulful thing. You have Mos Def doing his rapping thing. And you have this really electronic-driven beat here. And you mix all these things together, and it creates something really unique and interesting and fun to listen to. And that could be said for a lot of the tracks on this record. It's just a super creative album. There's so much genre experimenting here on this record that it feels consistently interesting while listening to it. All the features on this thing absolutely kill their roles. The core band themselves do a great job on this thing as well. Many catchy, memorable hooks packed into this record too. And like I said, the concept of, pollution and artificiality that's packed into the lyrics and the sound of this thing is really interesting too. And I love how they're able to take the concept and, as I said before, mix it into the sound and presentation of this record, not just in the lyrics, because that just makes the record that much more interesting in my opinion. Plenty of artists make concept albums where the concept is strictly confined to the lyrics, but very few, I feel, take that and expand it into not only the sound but also the story of a record too. And I think the Gorillaz are able to do that in a way that many artists haven't on this project. So yeah, overall, Plastic Beach, really fun project, really creative, very interesting, lots of genre blending here. If you like that stuff, give this thing a listen. Next on my list, I have the Pop 2 mixtape from Charlie XCX released in 2017. This is a project that I never reviewed in 2017 because I didn't hear it in 2017, but I wish I had, because this would have been my favorite release of that year had I heard it in that year, because this is just a really creative, fun pop mixtape that I find myself coming back to over and over and over again because of how catchy and fun this thing is. It sees Charlie XCX playing around with her kind of experimental form of pop music, and while that's a style that she's played around with a lot in recent years, and while it is a style of music that has grown in popularity in recent years as well, one thing I really like about her, style of it, I guess, her way of doing it, is just how accessible she manages to keep it at the same time. Nothing on this mixtape is super weird or out there really, or anything that I think if you showed an average pop music fan that they'd be too weirded out by. But at the same time, there's enough really interesting stuff going on in the production of this record to make it really interesting and vibrant and colorful too. I also really like Charlie's performances on these tracks too, not only when it comes to the really catchy hooks on this album, but also when it comes to just the sound of her voice more generally. I like the different vocal effects that she uses here on this thing to add this kind of cold, distant feel to her voice. I feel like it pairs up really nicely with the sound of a lot of these instrumentals too, and it really adds a ton of personality to this thing while also making it feel a little bit more focused and cohesive. I also like a lot of the features on this thing too. There's quite a lot of them here on this project, but they all add a good amount of character to the tracks that they respectively appear on, while not detracting from Charlie's presence or the production's presence or any of just that core stuff that makes this mixtape what it is. Pop 2 is just a super fun pop mixtape. I feel like there's a good amount of diversity on this thing when it comes to different sounds and styles that's being played around with. The production here on this thing is excellent. The features are pretty great too. Charlie's performances on this thing are excellent. The hooks are catchy. It's just a really fun pop release, one that you should certainly hear. Moving on though, the next release I want to talk about is probably the most controversial pick I have so far here on this list. But this is one of the albums that I've actually been listening to the longest out of any of the albums here on this list. It's a release that came out very early in the decade, and as such I've had plenty of time to sit with this particular album, and I feel very certain about its inclusion here on this list. Like I said before, many of the spots on this list have certainly changed with time, but in every iteration of this list, this album has been included. I'm talking about the 2010 album from Linkin Park, 1,000 Suns. This was an album that when it was first released didn't really have a ton of fans, to say the least. Linkin Park fans didn't really want this kind of weird experimental record. People who were kind of into weird and experimental music didn't really want a Linkin Park record, and this album really didn't have a ton of fans. At the time though, I really didn't have lots of expectations when it came to music more generally when I first heard this thing. So I ended up really enjoying this record, and I still really enjoy this record all these years later. I think it's the most creative and interesting and unique album that Linkin Park has made to date. It's just a super interesting project to listen to, just because every single song on this thing feels not only unique from each other, but for the most part, very unique and different from anything else Linkin Park has done at any other point in their career. I mean, sure, there's maybe a couple tracks on this thing where you could see how it might connect to some of the stuff they've done at other points, but still, the personality of all these songs is very well defined and unique here on A Thousand Suns. And it's one thing I've really loved about this project over the years, just how much stuff the band is able to pack into this project here. You have tracks like The Catalyst, which has this very intense electronic build-up to it. The track Blackout starts off with this very minimalistic instrumental, while Chester is just giving one of his most intense vocal performances in the band's entire catalog, before the song moves on to this very electronic, noisy, glitchy breakdown, before again transitioning into this kind of atmospheric, spacier section of the song, while the instrumental builds a bit in intensity. It's just a very well structured and very creatively structured song, unlike anything else the band has done before. You have tracks like Wretches and Kings, which sees the more typical rap rock style of the band kind of being mixed together with this harsher, more industrial sound. You have some poppier moments like Waiting for the End. You have the acoustic closing to this thing, The Messenger. There's so much different stuff going on here in these various tracks, and I think the band does an excellent job when it comes to the execution of all these different ideas too. I know a lot of people aren't into the sample tracks on this thing where the band is just providing maybe a snippet of like a speech or something with some, manipulation to it or something like that. But personally, I find the skit tracks on this thing to be pretty interesting. I think they add a lot to the character of this record too, adding to that post-apocalyptic feel that this album has. And one thing I really appreciate about this record is how focused this thing feels in spite of its various genre influences, mostly because thematically it feels very focused on this nuclear post-apocalyptic feel, and it just creates a very engaging concept in my opinion. This is a record that I put on and I just get sucked into the feel of this record so easily, and that includes a lot of these skits here on this thing, the speeches and whatnot. I know a lot of people don't like them, but I personally really like them. I know it's probably a very hot take within an already very hot take of liking this record, but yeah, I guess, sue me, I guess. I really like this thing. And I really like the fact that this album seems to be getting a bit more praise as the years have gone by, maybe in part due to the fact that One More Light kind of took the place of being the new worst Linkin Park album in a lot of people's eyes. But I feel like even before the release of that record, lots of people were kind of looking back on this album a bit more positively than what I was seeing when I first got into this record, like in 2012 or 2013, whenever it was I first heard this thing. But yeah, I think this is a really creative project. I think it's a lot more interesting and a lot more detailed than a lot of people have given it credit for over the years. If you're looking for an album to give a critical reevaluation to in the upcoming years, just saying, this is maybe an album that we should talk about, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff packed into this project, and I feel like a lot of people didn't really give it its proper respect the first time around, just for one of many reasons. But yeah, overall, A Thousand Suns, a project that I've loved for years now, one that I hope I'll still be enjoying years from now. Yeah, check this thing out. I know a lot of people maybe gave this thing a listen when it first came out, but didn't really give it much thought after that. But if you're one of those people, maybe return to this thing, see what it has in store for you, come into it with an open mind. And if you've never listened to this album before, I'd say the same for you. Come into this thing with an open mind, and you might find something worth enjoying. Maybe you won't like it quite as much as I do, but if you can find any enjoyment in this record at all, I would consider that a positive. So yeah, listen to this thing. I think it's critically underrated. Next up on the list, I have Clipping with their 2019 album, There Existed an Addiction to Blood, my favorite album of last year, and a record that it's still less than a year after it's been released. It's still an album that I come back to quite a lot, just because I find this thing so unique and interesting. I love the sound present on this record, Clipping, playing with very noisy, harsh, kind of off-kilter styles of hip-hop. But one thing that really stands out on this record is the lyrics and how the concept of this album plays out. Clipping played around with a lot of different horror-related imagery here on this project, but it's not just to have this kind of spooky atmosphere here on this project. It's mostly to have a way of telling various stories and concepts related to the Black experience in America while tying it to these horror-related concepts. And the result is that you get these songs talking about topics that, sure, other artists out there have touched upon them before, but the presentation has never been done before like it is done on this album. This horror perspective on these real-world topics is very interesting. I think Clipping do a good job at managing to balance the seriousness of a lot of the subject matter here with this very dark, horrific atmosphere that they managed to create here on these tracks. And the atmosphere here on this record that's caused due to a lot of the instrumentals on this thing, like I said before, sounding really harsh and noisy. It pairs up really excellently with the lyrics here to add to that horrifying atmosphere here on this thing. The rapping on this project, in addition to all of that, is fantastic too. There's some really catchy hooks on this thing as well. In spite of the fact that this record tends to be pretty out there and kind of weird, one thing I really appreciate about this thing is that the band isn't above sneaking in a catchy hook every now and again on this thing, and it just makes some of these songs stand out even more. There's also just some pretty weird experiments on this thing, probably the most notable being the closing track to this thing, which is I believe it's 16 or 17 minutes of a piano burning. It's weird, but as I said in my review of this album, which I highly recommend you check out if you want to hear my further thoughts on this thing, I feel like it fits the tone of this record really nicely. It feels like a cool down after the very intense the rest of the album that came before it. Overall, There Exists an Addiction to Blood is a super creative, super original, and super well produced and performed album, one that if you're into weird experimental hip-hop, you need to check out. Moving on to the next spot on the list, though, let's stay on the topic of kind of weird off-kilter hip-hop with the Brockhampton album Iridescence, released in 2018. Yes, we're talking about these guys again, but what can I say? I liked all the albums they put out this decade quite a lot. Of course, not all of them made the list, but this one here, Iridescence, is my favorite, which is another hot take here. I know this is probably their least liked album, but it's one that I found myself enjoying the most, not only when it was first released, but now almost a couple of years after it was first released, I still find myself coming back to this album in particular the most out of all of their releases. Instrumentally, it's probably one of their more out there and abrasive sounding projects. I think that it pairs up really nicely with a lot of the themes discussed in the lyrics here on these tracks too, as the group is covering a lot of more dark subject matter on this thing. As I said before when I talked about Saturation 3, on that project they brought up some uncertainty about their future, and here on this album it really comes up in full force as there's a lot of doubt present here on this project, a lot of fear, and it just feels like Brockhampton is in this very uncertain place here on this project, and I think a lot of that uncertainty is detailed really nicely in the lyrics here on this project. I think all the group members do a great job of talking about this in their own sort of unique way. I still feel like all the group members here do some really interesting stuff with their performances. Some of them step into some new territory on this project too, and it leads to some very excellent results. The chemistry between all the group members here on this thing is excellent as well. It still feels very cohesive, but it also at the same time feels like Brockhampton is kind of breaking apart and flying off in various directions, but in the best kind of way. And despite the fact this is a very focused record, there's lots of really weird and out there moments on this thing too, whether it be the very aggressive, harsh Joe Vert, or the kind of sad trilogy of tracks that comes towards the very end of this thing, or maybe you'll get some more traditional straightforward tracks on this thing like New Orleans, for example. There's a good amount of variety here to keep you entertained is what I'm trying to say, but at the same time I feel like all the tracks lyrically have a very tight, cohesive feel to them with what the band is trying to say, but at the same time what they're all trying to get across here is this kind of fragmented, uncertain idea. So it's a bit confusing in that regard, I guess, to explain, but when you listen to it, it all comes together and makes a good amount of sense, and I find myself coming back to this record quite a lot as a result of this, because I find lyrically it to be their most vulnerable and interesting project to date. Instrumentally, I think it's their most interesting project to date too. In terms of the performances, it has some of the best from the group so far. Overall, Iridescence is a great project in my opinion. While it's one that, like I said before, it's probably their least liked album so far, I think it's their best one so far. I think it needs maybe a little bit of a critical reevaluation. I know it hasn't even been 2 years since its release, but just saying, if we're gonna reevaluate 1,000 Suns, maybe we could throw Iridescence in there as well. Next up, though, I'm going to be talking about Queens of the Stone Age with their 2013 album Like Clockwork. A really fantastic rock record from these guys. Queens of the Stone Age are one of my favorite groups, but I think this record in particular is a real big high point from them. Probably my favorite album from them overall, just because it manages to do a lot of what I like from the Queens of the Stone Age, but at the same time it adds so much more to the formula as well. I like how cohesive this project feels. I like how lyrically this is probably the most vulnerable the Queens of the Stone Age have ever sounded on a record, but at the same time, there's moments on this thing that are maybe a little bit more upbeat, maybe a little bit more aggressive as well. There's a good mix of sounds and ideas here on this thing, and instrumentally, it's probably one of the more diverse releases from this band as well. You'll have your slower, sadder tracks on this thing like Sat by the Ocean, or I Appear Missing, or the title track, for example. You'll have your more upbeat stoner rock jam like My God is the Sun, for example. It's a very interesting collection of tracks, but I feel like they all come together to make something very interesting. And the features here on this project do a great job of adding to this thing as well, whether it be artists like Dave Grohl providing some of the drums, or Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails coming on the track Collapsia to add some great vocals in addition to Hami's already great vocals. I feel like the features here not only are, star-studded when it comes to who the people are, but they bring their A-game to this thing while not distracting from the core sound of the Queens of the Stone Age at the same time. The features here, for the most part, aren't super prominent, but they're there and they add a ton to this thing too. Overall, this record has some of the best hooks from the Queens of the Stone Age. I love the sound of this record too, the production style that is. It has some of the most memorable riffs from the band too. It is just the most enjoyable project of theirs so far, I think. It has the most vulnerability present in it, some of the most emotional moments in the band's catalog, and I find the record particularly interesting in that regard too. It's just a fantastic rock release, my favorite rock album of the 2010s, hands down, one that you should certainly hear. And finally, at number 1 on the list, we have my favorite record of the 2010s, and it is the 2014 record from Run the Jewels, Run the Jewels 2, the second release from this musical supergroup collaboration between LP and Killer Mike. And their second record remains my favorite album of theirs and my favorite record of the 2010s, just because it is such a fun, enjoyable, but at the same time deep, I guess you could say, hip-hop release. I feel like the production here on this thing is some of the most creative LP has put out on a project before, whether it be ranging from some of the more aggressive, hard-hitting bangers on this thing, or some of the more reserved, calmer moments on this thing too, on tracks like Crown, or Angel Duster, or Early, for example. LP and Killer Mike's rapping here on this project is fantastic too, not only when it comes to the actual rapping itself, but also when it comes to the chemistry that the two have here on this thing. While I like the chemistry that they had on the first Run the Jewels project, I feel like they really stepped it up on Run the Jewels 2 when it comes to their ability, trade off verses, for example, here on this thing. They just feel a lot more connected on this project than they did on the first Run the Jewels record, and I think it pays off quite a lot. A lot of the hooks on this thing are super memorable too. The features add a ton to this record as well, and lyrically, it's a pretty enjoyable project too. You'll have your more fun tracks on this thing, but at the same time, there'll also be tracks that dive into a lot more serious subject matter. Tracks like Crown or Angel Dust that come towards the very end of this thing, for example, are two of the most hard-hitting in Run the Jewels' entire catalog, and two of my favorites from the band for that reason. So basically on this record you have some fantastic rapping, some fantastic instrumentals, some great features, excellent hook work that's really memorable. You mix all that together with a good amount of variety when it comes to what these songs are talking about, and how the tracks sound, and what kind of tone each of them is going for, and you have the record be at a pretty concise runtime too, and you end up with the perfect kind of hip-hop project for me to just come back to over and over and over again to re-listen to, just because this is the kind of album that is just so much fun to return to with all of those things present on it. It's not heavy enough that I don't want to listen to it too much because it's just that sad or dark or anything quite like that. It's not too shallow that it becomes boring after a while. It's just the perfect kind of hip-hop release for me personally. Like, this is perfectly geared towards my taste in hip-hop to be the kind of release that I just come back to over and over and over again. So yeah, it's really not much of a surprise that it ended up being my favorite record of the decade. This is just a phenomenal album, and if you haven't checked out Run the Jewels or this album yet in particular, change that because it's a really great release. But yeah, with all of that out of the way, that concludes my top 20 favorite albums of the 2010s. Again, everything I've said in this video so far is just my own personal opinion when it comes to these records, so if you disagree, that is perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on these records in the comment section down below, or feel free to leave your own list for your favorite records of the 2010s in the comment section down below. I greatly appreciate seeing what were some of the records that I might have missed from the last decade, because I'd be more than happy to check out some of those releases, because I'm sure there's plenty of albums out there that were fantastic that I just never got around to listening to because I didn't have enough time to, or just because I didn't know the records even existed. So yeah, that really sums up everything I have to say here today. Thank you guys again for watching this video. Make sure you leave a like down below, comment like I said before, follow me on all my social medias linked in the description. Thanks for watching once again, and stay golden.